By the 1950s in American horror cinema, the popularity of the vampire and other gothic monsters had begun to dwindle. Instead, as America entered a new era of atomic threat, vampires and werewolves were replaced by giant bugs and aliens from outer space.
There is no word to describe them.
But over in the UK, Hammer Studios were about to resurrect the gothic classic monsters in a way audiences had never seen before. In 1957, Hammer produced one of the very first British horror movies in colour, The Curse of Frankenstein. It starred Peter Cushing as the titular star and Christopher Lee as the monster. Off the back of the huge success of this, Hammer followed it up with an adaptation of Dracula 1 year later. It too starred Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee as the hero and villain, and from the moment the film began with a splatter of impossibly red blood across Dracula's tomb, it was clear this was the dawn of an entirely new era of gruesome Dracula movies, the likes of which we'd never seen before. Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of the vampire, and we discuss two early Hammer classics, Dracula and Brides of Dracula.
I am Dracula, and I welcome you to my house.
Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Munzer, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres one series at a time. We are currently in the middle of our 8th season, exploring the evolution of the vampire movie, and this is part 5. This episode is sponsored by $20 Patreon subscriber Dark Lord Chuckles. It's an excellent name. And in this week's episode, as that intro suggested, we are going to be looking at two of the early Hammer horror Dracula movies. That's Dracula, or The Horror of Dracula from 1958, and Brides of Dracula from 1960. Both of these conversations will be spoilerific. Go and give both movies a watch before listening to our discussion. So joining me to discuss all things Hammer horror, he was last here only a few weeks ago on part 1 of our vampire series, but he's such a huge fountain of knowledge and a huge fan of Hammer horror that I had to get him back. Welcome, Kevin Lyons. Hello, Kev.
Hello, Mike. Good to be back again.
Oh, it's such a joy to have you back, especially discussing Hammer horror, right? One of your faves.
Well, what a joy to be talking about these two particular films. They just don't get any better than this, really, for me. So,
I love it.
Marvellous.
I can't wait to get into them both with you. First of all, just tell me a little bit. Now, we've discussed this briefly in the past already, but tell me a little bit about your history with Hammer. When did you first fall in love with Hammer horror, Kev?
Well, the first Hammer films that I can remember seeing were actually both Dracula films, as luck would have it. I can remember being allowed to stay up way past my bedtime because I was really into horror, but I wasn't allowed to watch horror films, which is really bizarre because I was buying, magazines and books about them, but I wasn't allowed to watch horror films. Different time back in the 70s. And
yes.
I was allowed to stay up to watch Taste the Blood of Dracula. Ooh. And unfortunately, anybody who's seen it will know that a very short time into it, there's a brothel scene. And there was that awkward shuffling that you used to get from your parents. I think it's time for bed now. Time for bed. Off you go. Off you go. And it took me years to see the ending or even the middle bit of Taste the Blood of Dracula. But I was eventually allowed to stay up and see Dracula AD 1972. Oh. And so I have a real sort of soft spot for that one. I will fight anybody who tries to tell me it's not any good. And that was, I think, my first Hammer film as well. I may have seen things like She and 1 Million Years BC, but it was certainly my first Hammer gothic horror film.
I just watched AD 1972 for the first time this week, actually, because I'm going to cover it in more depth next week, and I loved it.
It's
absolutely
brilliant.
Loved it.
It's
so
full of
fun.
It's full of young people as imagined by middle-aged, middle-class white people who've never actually met a young person who say things like, dig the music, kids. No one ever said that. I'm an old hippie and we never said that, trust me. But it's brilliant.
It's so much of that, isn't it? That kind of like far out man.
Yeah.
Music. Yeah. It's brilliant. It's just
marvelous,
brilliant, isn't it? So, yeah, I mean, that's really interesting there. You talked about, seeing it too young. There's a kind of brothel scene. And I was going to ask you, I think that leads into what I was going to ask you, which is how you would sort of describe your typical Hammer horror. And I think that's kind of what I think of, maybe a little bit of sleaziness, mixed with a little bit of gore, showing us stuff on screen that maybe we hadn't seen before at that point. But tell me, how would you describe a typical Hammer horror film?
Well, to be honest, I'd say there's no such thing as a typical Hammer film to start with, because they did so many different things. You had the Gothics like the Frankensteins and the Draculas and so on. But, they did the things like I mentioned earlier, She and 1 Million Years BC. They did swashbucklers, comedies, psychological horrors. There was a lot more to Hammer than just the Gothic horrors. But if you're talking specifically about the Gothics, then, yeah, it was the sex and the violence, stuff we'd never seen before in a film, at least not to this degree. And who would have thought that it would come from, buttoned down, uptight Britain rather than, France or even America at the time, They outdid us eventually. Obviously, they went a lot further than the British horror films did. But we led the way with Hammer. This was quite a shock to the system, I think. You certainly read some of the reviews that were around of those early Gothics, and people were appalled and outraged by them. And quite right. So it's probably why I love them, to be honest, because they upset so many people.
Yeah, so, yeah, you're right. I mean, it's interesting that we were, and I think there's an interesting sort of journey that Hammer goes on by, like, it feels a bit like it. They start off being quite ahead of the curve, and then maybe by sort of AD 1972 feel a bit behind the curve, right? By that point,
Well, I think Michael Carreras, who took over the running of the company in the early 70s, he did an awful lot to try and experiment and try and push Hammer away from the sort of over-reliance on traditional Gothic.
Right.
And so you ended up in the early 70s with some really interesting films. They didn't all work. Not all of them worked by any means, but when they did, you had things like Hands of the Ripper and things like that. They were amazingly good films. But, they were trying to ring the changes a bit. They'd had this sort of double whammy in 1968 of Rosemary's Baby and Night of the Living Dead, which had dragged horror screaming into the 20th century. And, no longer was it about petticoats and, sort of people being a little bit saucy but still a bit coy. This was kind of full-on in-your-face stuff. And then by 1974, when The Exorcist came along, horror had changed quite dramatically. And so those Gothics had kind of had their day by then. But for that period between like 1957 and 1972, 3, 4, they reigned supreme, and they were some of the best horror films ever made. They really are. The best. Hammer are just unbeatable.
Yeah, it's really interesting that, isn't it? Because like you say, that they didn't really have anything like this in the US even at this point, right? Like, where was American horror at the sort of late 50s, around the time that Hammer was sort of kicking off?
Well, it was a bit anemic, really, because for most part of the decade, they'd been really into their science fiction films. You'd got that sort of post-Second World War, the start of the Cold War, the birth of the atomic age. That was the new horror. Sort of people creeping around in old castles and sort of, making monsters out of body parts didn't seem anywhere near as terrifying as being obliterated in nuclear war. So that would become the new thing. And the whole, particularly in America, the whole fear of communism, which has given rise to a lot of these science fiction films. That was where the fear was coming from now. So Hammer didn't entirely have it their own way. There were things around. You had things like The Fly and stuff like that. But then again, that's more science fiction than horror, I'd argue. It's still coming from that sort of tradition. So they had those films, but there was no Gothic horror being made at that time. So Hammer just came straight in with an open playing field. And they could so easily have just come in and said, we'll just do one. We'll just make a Gothic horror film. But they came in and made brilliant Gothic horror films. And that was what, that's what galvanized everybody. Within a couple of years, everybody, the Americans, the Italians, you name it, everybody was making Gothic horror films.
Yeah, because Gothic horror had kind of been dormant for a decade or so, hadn't it? I mean, we've just last week discussed the Universal era of Dracula films.
Yeah.
Where obviously it kicks things off in 1931 with Dracula, and then by the time you get to Abbott and Costello in 1948, that was sort of the end, wasn't it, really? So
sure,
it was kind of a decade had passed.
Even with Dracula, although it's actually set in 1931, you don't really get any impression that it's set in 1931. No. It still has that sort of old Gothic feel to it. And yeah, by the time we get to, the 40s films, they're very definitely set in the 1940s that looks like the 1940s. So the Gothic didn't quite feel the same way, but Hammer were having no truck with that to start with. They were setting it very firmly in this sort of indeterminate past, this indeterminate somewhere in Europe, It's
interesting as well because Hammer could have gone in that same direction as 50s sci-fi because they kind of start off with films like Quatermass, don't they?
That's right, yeah. They came in sort of the tail end of that 50s boom in science fiction films.
Yeah.
And, made amazing films like The Quatermass Experiment and Quatermass 2, which are absolutely brilliant films. X the Unknown, fantastic film. But these, again, were slightly edging towards horror. There are moments of real horror in all of them. In Quatermass Experiment, where you've got the astronaut and he's suffering.
Yes.
He's very close to Frankenstein's monster. Mm-hmm. He didn't ask to be this way. He's been created this way by science. Yeah. He's struggling with what he is. He's become a monster. People want to kill him. And it's not his fault. He doesn't want to be like this. So, the groundwork was already being done by them. So it was kind of inevitable, I guess, that they were going to end up this way.
Yeah. And I wonder if that's kind of why the first Gothic movie they did was Frankenstein rather than Dracula in a way, maybe because it leaned more into that sci-fi or something, I don't know, but it's interesting that this wave begins with Frankenstein before Dracula, doesn't it? Yeah.
It may be an even more prosaic answer to that, actually, that there was a guy called Milton Subotsky, who we'll know as the guy who went on to run Amicus.
Yes.
And he approached Hammer because it realised that Frankenstein was in the public domain at that point.
Okay.
So he approached them with a script for Frankenstein, and so the story goes, Hammer said, well, if the script is in the public domain, why do we need to pay you? We'll do it in-house.
Yes.
Sling your hook, off you go, which explains Milton Subotsky's animosity towards Hammer over the next couple of decades, basically. But yeah, so it was more of an opportunist thing, I think. But I'm sure it must have appealed to them when they looked at it and thought, look at this, more mad science.
Yeah.
This is perfect. This, Quatermass had done so well. And now we've got another scientist. We've got the maddest of all scientists. Let's do this. This is great. And of course, it went off in a different direction, but it's the roots were there.
Absolutely, and I guess it was that. That kind of feels like it sets the template, doesn't it? Obviously, you've got Peter Cushing as our leading man, Christopher Lee as the monster. I'm assuming it was due to the success of Frankenstein that what we got after that, basically.
Oh, yes, of course. It was a huge hit, Curse of Frankenstein. It was the first proper horror film in colour.
Yeah.
There had been others, but there hadn't been many. And this was certainly the first one to be using, they weren't even using blood in Curse of Frankenstein. They were splashing it about by comparison to earlier films. This was shocking stuff, It was, and there was, even in the Frankenstein films, there was more, if not overt sexuality, then at least it was being very heavily hinted at.
Yes.
In the films, there's a hint he does something awful to the maid, which we'd never seen in a horror film before. So of course this was, hugely controversial. Got the critics got their collective knickers in a twist, and that will always guarantee that the public will turn up to see it. So, so as soon as the critics say this is disgusting, you shouldn't see this, we're all in the queue, aren't we? So, that's what happened even back then, even in 1957. They said this is an appalling film, this is dreadful. So everybody was going, is it really that bad? Let's go and have a look. Of course they were,
I love it. And there's that feeling of a kind of bygone era too of I guess studio-led or production company-led horror films rather than auteur-led horror films, right? Which is what we would get more into the 60s and 70s, particularly in America. But this idea that we don't get this so much anymore, maybe with Marvel, but this idea of this production company, this production house churning out almost like a factory, these movies that reuse the same actors and sets, and, they have a real stamp, a real authorship in a way.
They use the same key personnel over and over again in front of the camera and behind the camera, and that probably helped them no end because they all worked together as a team. They could make these things very quickly.
Yeah.
You know, it sounds slightly demeaning, but it was a bit like a production line. And I don't mean that in a demeaning way. It's just the fact they could make these films very quickly, relatively cheaply, and get them made into the hands of a distributor and onto a cinema screen really, really quickly. And that was down to the fact that these guys, they were all seasoned professionals anyway. That, you know, we didn't have young upstarts doing this. By the time, you know, Hammer came around, most of the people who'd been working for the company, they'd been working there for a very long time.
Right.
Or in the industry for a very long time. And so they all knew exactly what they were doing. They could just get in and out very, very quickly. And as you could say, they could recycle sets. Bray Studios was actually an old house called Down Place. And it was tiny. You know, when you actually see it, you know, in real life or in the behind the scenes photographs, it's a really, really small soundstage, a set of sound stages. And, you know, the offices were some of the bedrooms upstairs and that kind of thing. It was a very, very small setup. And yet, you know, what they were able to do with lighting and set design and camera angles was absolutely astonishing. If you watch enough of them back to back, you can have a lot of fun picking out props and bits of a wall over. Oh, yeah, that's a bit of the wall that was in the Frankenstein film we watched yesterday, that kind of thing. And they turn up all the time. It's a lot of fun doing that.
That's so cool. What's become of that building where they filmed them all, Bray Studios in Berkshire? You know, is it still there? Can you still go and visit it? What is it now?
It's a hotel. Well, it was a hotel.
Oh, really?
I haven't really been keeping up with it, but I gather that they're reopening it, or have reopened it, in fact, for as a studio, as a production studio.
Right.
Indeed, I believe that the Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat Dracula was partly filmed there.
Excellent, of course.
Because, you know, obviously those guys know their stuff, they know their history, and they thought if we're going to make a Dracula TV show, we might as well go and make it where, you know, the best Dracula films were made.
Yes.
So, they set up camp there.
Fantastic.
So, yeah, it's still there. You can go and see all the buildings that they worked in, you know, one time or another. They're all still around. They're all still out there. And I don't think you can just go wander in. You can't just come in off the street and go, oh, excuse me, I'm a Hammer film fan, I've come to have a look. You can't do that, but you can get a good look at them from a distance. Yeah,
that's really cool, isn't it? So before we get into the film itself, I just want to quickly ask you about Dracula, the Hammer series as well. We've just talked about the kind of Universal movies and the sort of various sort of sequels and you know, but I remember you saying in our first chat of this series that this is your sort of favourite Dracula series on screen. Is that right?
Oh, definitely. There's only one in the series that I don't like, and you can all go away and make a cup of tea in a minute because I'm going to start foaming at the mouth talking about that. So bear with me. But yeah, there was a whole series of them. They made the two that we're going to look at in detail today, which was Dracula that was released in 1958, and there was Brides of Dracula in 1960. But then they waited 6 years until the next one, Dracula, Prince of Darkness.
Yeah.
And then I'm not entirely sure why it took them 6 years to do it. I think they were just making so many other great films away from the Dracula series. There just wasn't time to do it.
Yeah.
But then you had marvellously titled films like Dracula Has Risen from the Grave.
Yeah.
And Taste the Blood of Dracula.
Yes.
Marvellous. Good stuff. I know all three of those, Prince of Darkness, Taste the Blood, Risen from the Grave, all really good films. Really good films. They're not as good as the first two, maybe, but, you know, this is... Compare them to any other vampire film being made in the 60s. These things are way, 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 way in advance of all the others. Yeah. Unfortunately, when we get to 1970, we run into Scars of Dracula. Oh, dear God. It's not quite the worst Hammer film ever made. Its double bill partner is the worst Hammer film ever made, Horror of Frankenstein. You could go and waste 3 hours of your life in 1970 watching the two shoddiest gothic horror films that they ever made. Absolutely dreadful film. And, you know, I'm sorry, Scars has got its fans, and I know right now there'll be people throwing things at their computer screens or whatever they're listening to this on, and this guy's a bloody idiot. But no, I'm sorry, Scars of Dracula is bloody awful. And I think Hammer themselves thought, actually, you know, we've got to do something about this, because the next two films in the series, they brought everything up to date.
Yes.
With the aforementioned Dracula AD 1972, with the least convincing group of groovy young things you've ever seen on screen, but they are brilliant. They are wonderful. I love them all. They're great. And then Dracula, Satanic Rites of Dracula, which followed 2 years later. And that's a lot of fun. That's kind of
it's like a spy movie.
James Bond. Yeah, it's like James Bond meets the undead, isn't it? It's fantastic. So much fun. And then there was one more which people tend to overlook a little bit, I think, is The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires. And that's because Dracula's only in it very briefly. He's only at the beginning. It's not Christopher Lee. He's played by John Forbes Robertson in that one. And, he turns into a Chinese guy and they go off to Hong Kong to do some kung fu fighting. So it's not quite part of the main series, but, Dracula's in it. But they're all, apart from Scars, they're all fun, and I'd recommend all of them. And if you watch all of them and you stuck for things to do, watch Scars, because then you'll realise just how bloody good the other ones are. When you can see just how bad they can get, you realise, oh my God, we were so lucky with the other ones,
Yes, absolutely. It's really interesting that, isn't it? The way in which the story's kind of like grown and gone off in different directions. How far we've come, by the time we're in AD 1972, how far we've come from Bram Stoker's original novel in a way.
Yeah. I mean, in fairness, the first film is a very long way from the novel.
Yes, which we'll get to.
And so, they were never really sticklers for, literary accuracy, and quite right too, in a way, because, they were doing their own thing with it.
The
1931 Dracula isn't particularly close to the novel. It's, it's closer to the play.
Yes.
There hasn't been, I don't think there's ever been a film that's been massively close to it. I think the BBC Louis Jourdan TV movie from the late 70s, I think that probably comes the closest to the book.
Yes.
But it's a very difficult book to film, so they have to do something with it,
My favourite thing about both AD 1972 and Universal's Son of Dracula is how long it takes people to realise that Alucard is Dracula.
Yeah. There's a wonderful bit in AD 72 where Peter Cushing, who's played the grandson of Van Helsing, sits there with a bit of paper, and people who've seen it have started laughing already. I can hear them, but if you haven't seen it, it's brilliant. And he writes the name Alucard, which is this character in the film, and realises it, and he actually draws it out with little lines to actually realise that Alucard is Dracula backwards. This is the descendant of the great fearless vampire hunter. And it's like, it didn't pass a lot of stuff on to you, did it?
So good, I love it. But anyway, let's go. So let's go back to the beginning, and we'll start talking about Dracula, or Horror of Dracula, as it's known in the States, right? From 1958.
This is the story of Dracula, a creature who destroys all whom he touches. Dracula the terrifying, the feared, who sleeps in the tombs of the dead by day and arises at night to inflict his terror upon the innocent and the unsuspecting.
Oh, you must help me. You must. You're my only hope. You must.
I'll help you. I promise.
It begins as it means to go on. There's the kind of a statement of intent in the very opening shot, where you see the title is actually Dracula's name on a sarcophagus, onto which drips very, very red blood. So, I mean, right away, right from the very start, this is Hammer saying this is not like a Dracula film you've ever seen before.
Yeah.
Buckle up. This is going to be a bumpy ride for those of you who are a bit squeamish. It's and I think it was a very clever. I think I mentioned this in the introductory episode. I'm not a huge fan of the novel. I find it slightly stodgy, slightly dry. I got its fans. I don't dislike it, but I just find it a bit of a difficult read. And part of the genius of the Hammer Dracula is that Jimmy Sangster, who wrote the screenplay, strips it right down. Mm-hmm. He sort of looked at it and said, what are the core essentials of this film? Took the bits he wanted, threw away the rest, and made up some new bits. So what you get all this sort of concatenation of characters, there are new characters invented and so on. And basically what happens in this one is you've got Jonathan Harker, who's played by John Van Assen. He travels off to Transylvania in 1885 to take up a new post as a librarian for Count Dracula, who is, of course, Christopher Lee. And he arrives, he finds a terrified young woman roaming around the castle, who at first we don't really know who she is. Valerie Gaunt, fantastic performance. And, of course, we're one step ahead of Harker the whole time. We know that Dracula is the vampire. And what's interesting, one of the nice twists in this one is that Harker already knows it.
That's a great moment, that little reveal.
It's good, isn't it?
Yeah.
It turns out he's an agent of Van Helsing who's gone ahead to, they'd be looking for Dracula, and it's sort of like the first attempt to get rid of him. And so it all goes horribly wrong. Of course it does. This is no spoiler. It wouldn't be much of a film really, would it, if it didn't go horribly wrong. And he ends up in a coffin down in the basement, and Van Helsing turns up a few days later, and this is the great Peter Cushing making his first appearance in the role. And it doesn't come to Britain like it does in the book and in other versions of the film. They're actually in a town called Karlstadt.
Yes.
And you'll find Karlstadts turning up all over Hammer films. Never existed, but it turns out it seems to be a different place. And if it's not called Karlstadt, it's exactly the same place. They've just given it a new name. It's just the same.
It's kind of somewhere in the middle of Europe or something, right? Like
it's Mittel Europe, I think they call it. And it's there somewhere. You're not quite sure where it is. But Dracula starts setting his sights on Harker's fiancée, Lucy, played by Carol Marsh. And got Michael Gough playing Arthur Homewood, who is Lucy's brother, who's trying to protect them. His wife, Mina, played by Melissa Stribling. Lucy gets bitten by Dracula. The rest of it kind of follows the story that we kind of know.
Yeah.
Except it's not so much the story, it's the way the story's told that made the difference. If you remember back to the Universal 1931 Dracula, it's got probably the most anticlimactic ending to any Dracula film, where the camera pans discreetly away and you hear off camera and he gets staked, and then the camera pans back. You don't get that. You get this riotous ending in the Hammer film with, one of the things they brought to the film that we'd not seen before was this incredible dynamism.
Yes.
It's moving all the time. It never sits still. And at the end, you've got this fantastic battle royale between Van Helsing and Dracula, where they're pursuing each other around the castle. And it's one of the most famous endings, I think, to any horror film. And if you haven't seen the film, please stop listening now. I don't want to. You know that Dracula's going to die. You know that, but it's the way he's going to die that's this important. So please go and watch the film, then come back. There's this marvelous scene where the Dracula is cornered in this room. And Van Helsing spots the curtains and spots the sunlight coming through. And he bounds across the table, runs the length of the table, leaps athletically through the air to tear down the curtains, grabs a couple of candlesticks and forces Dracula back with it, makes a cross with it, forces him back into the light, where he very painfully disintegrates. You can actually see, in some shots of it, Dracula is crying.
Yes.
He's shedding tears, because the pain of it all. And this ending was partly inspired by Peter Cushing, who sort of quite famously said to the director, Terence Fisher, he was getting a bit fed up with just whipping a crucifix out. He said he was a little bit like a travelling crucifix salesman, because, everywhere he went, there was a crucifix. And he thought, we've got to do something a bit better than this. The original plan was he'd just go up to Dracula and force him back with one of his ready-made crucifixes.
Yeah.
And it was Cushing who suggested, let's try something different between them. They blocked it all out. And you've got this fantastically energetic ending, which just leaves you completely breathless when you're watching it. Absolutely marvellous.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm sure even people that haven't seen the film probably will recognise the images from that final act. Dracula is killed and all of that. It's so
good. And he's disintegrating. Again, that's something we'd seen other films like the Return of Dracula, is it called? I can't remember. The Fantastic Vanishing Man, it was called over here. In that one, Dracula had fallen onto a stake and there'd been like a superimposition of him turning into a skeleton.
Yeah.
But in the Hammer film, he disintegrates. He falls apart. There's like his hand crumbles away to dust. It's a horrific ending. You almost, and I have to keep on emphasising, almost feel sorry for him.
Yes.
Because, such is the strength of the performance. He's clearly in agony. He's clearly, this is not the way he foresaw his night going. He thought, I'm Dracula, I'm invincible. And then suddenly he's just fading away literally to dust. And what's beautiful is that the way Peter Cushing plays Van Helsing's reaction, there's no triumphalism in it. Mm-hmm. There's no, sort of, yes, I've won. He looks almost as traumatised by what he's done as Dracula's feeling. He just knows that he's got to do. He's like an exterminator. You know, he doesn't really want to do this, but he's got to for the sake of everybody's safety, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a tremendous film, actually, isn't it? Especially after...
Oh, it's a masterpiece.
Having watched it straight off the back of watching the Universal one, which does have its merits, but like you said, it's lovely to see something with energy, with dynamism, you know, that really moves, and it's colourful in every sense of the word. You know, I think it's such an easy film to watch, and I mean that in the best way possible. You know.
Oh, it is. Yeah, that's a good way to say that. It's an easy watch. You don't. There's not a moment of flab in it at all. There's not a single moment where you're thinking, "Oh, I wish they'd get on with this." It just flies. It really does. It's incredible. Right from the very start, you know, you get the traditional sort of build-up scene of Harker arriving at the castle. It's still beautifully shot with so much to look at and so much incident going on. And the minute Christopher Lee comes down those steps and walks up to the camera, says, you know, I am Dracula and welcome to my house and all the rest of it. And it's just like, that's it. You're just hooked. It's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, I completely agree. You've touched upon this already, but I was going to ask you, how does this differ to sort of story-wise, I suppose, to both the novel and the versions that we've seen so far up until this point, films like Nosferatu and Universal's Dracula? Like you say, it kind of takes some liberties with the story, this one, doesn't it?
It's almost like the emphasis feels like it's more on Van Helsing than Dracula.
Yes.
We spend a lot more time with Van Helsing, and I kind of like that. I always like this idea that Dracula was this parasitic creature living in the background, in the darkness and stuff. And, you know, Christopher Lee gets a lot to do. He gets a lot more to do here than he does in some of the later films, which is always a bone of contention for old Christopher Lee. But he's still very much a sort of, you don't quite know where he's going to pop up. You know, he turns up in all sorts of weird places. In terms of how it's different to the previous films, I mean, obviously the blood. You know, we actually see blood. You know, all that stuff in the Universal one, you know, the blood is alive. It would have been nice to have seen some then, wouldn't it? But obviously the censorship rules at the time were not going to allow that. There's blood everywhere in this. Well, not quite blood everywhere, but there's a lot of blood about. You know, and more importantly, perhaps, is it ramps up the sexuality of the vampire. Vampires hadn't really been sexy up to this point. I know sort of Bela Lugosi had a kind of matinee idol following at the time, but you know, if you go and look at 5 minutes of Bela, bless him, and then look at 5 minutes of Christopher Lee, it's chalk and cheese, isn't it? You know, Christopher Lee is this tall, confident, almost arrogant, very powerful, and very sexual Dracula.
Yes.
You know, when he bites the women in the film, they don't just go, ugh. There's like an orgasmic response to him being there and biting them, you know, and that was something we'd not seen before. And I think that upset a lot of the critics more than the violence, I suspect.
Yeah, and I think also this Dracula is certainly compared to Bela Lugosi scarier, I think, right? I mean, Christopher Lee doesn't need to do much to be absolutely terrifying, I think.
Funny enough, I was talking to someone just this week about the lost art of stillness in acting.
Yes.
And, you know, we don't get enough of it. Everybody these days is twitching and, you know, sort of doing a little bit of business. Christopher Lee's fantastic at just standing there and looking at you. And your knees turn to jelly. He's not doing anything. He's just standing there looking. But then he could also do these sort of explosive moments where he would become quite feral. One of the great moments in the film is when Harker is talking to the vampire woman.
Yes.
And she's never referred to as Dracula's bride in this. He's just some woman he's keeping about the flat for whatever nefarious purposes, you know. He's just, he's his pad. He's going to do what he likes with this woman he's got there, you know. And you don't even want to think what he's doing, you know. He's awful.
Yes.
But she tries to seduce Harker. And not for any particularly sexual reason. It's just she's thirsty. She hasn't fed.
Yeah.
You know, Dracula is quite clearly starving her as well as anything else he's doing to her. And there's this wonderful scene where she's just about to put the bite on him.
Yeah.
And suddenly it cuts. It's a jump cut to Christopher Lee with blood all down his chin, hissing like a really, really angry cat. And he flies into the room, throws the woman to one side. This man is mine. Throws into one side of the room. And he's just... My God, it's breathtaking because it comes out of nowhere. There's no suspenseful build-up because the suspense in that scene is we're being led to believe that Harker is going to be bit by the vampire woman.
Yes. Yes.
And suddenly the rug is really, really, really pulled from under us. And there's Dracula. And it's a really shocking moment and absolutely brilliantly done.
Yeah, it is. And then, as is always the case with all versions of Dracula, after that first act, Dracula is then a little bit more in the shadows, in the periphery.
That's right,
isn't
yeah.
he? But again, it's used to much more effective means in this film than with,
Yes.
in 1931, I was talking with my guest last week about how you kind of miss him in the second half of that film. You kind of go, oh, come on, when are we going to see Bella again? Whereas with this movie, it is, not only are those scenes a bit more compelling, but also you are more scared that he is just outside or he's just downstairs or whatever throughout that entire thing,
The brilliance of Jimmy Sangster's script here, that he's able to suggest that Dracula is everywhere, that this is all pervading evil that's just behind the door, And this is something that Van Helsing really sort of plays up on, that he is this sort of powerful force of evil in the world and has to be stopped. And he does give that impression that he's going to, and that's why it's so scary. Once we've seen that first real horror scene of him suddenly coming out of nowhere, we're on edge the whole time. The rest of the film, we don't know when he's going to pop up next. Is he in that coffin that they go and look at? Is he going to come out from behind that door in the castle? It's really, really cleverly done, beautifully written and brilliantly directed.
It is, that moment when Lucy kind of is in bed and she knows that he's approaching, and the way that tension is built, where you look at the open doorway or the open window and everything.
That's right,
it's very good.
You know what's coming. You know perfectly well what's coming, but it's just the timing, the way it's done. And like I say, he's suddenly, he's there. He's this evil that's suddenly in your home. He's not lurking about in his castle anymore. He's now in your bedroom. And he's coming for you, and he's brilliantly done. That feeling that he's out there somewhere, and it doesn't matter what you do, he'll come and get you. He'll find you eventually. It's palpable all the way through that film.
Is Christopher Lee kind of as big a name at this point as he is right, to us now, or was this kind of early? Because obviously he'd played the monster in Frankenstein.
That's right,
hadn't he? Yeah.
But of course, he'd been buried under a lot of makeup in that one, so people didn't really get to see him. He'd been in the industry, he'd been acting for a very long time, but he wasn't. Peter Cushing was the big name because he'd done a lot of television. He'd done 1984, so people knew Peter Cushing. But I think this is the film. This is the moment that everybody goes, "Oh, that tall guy." That tall, handsome bloke. Do you remember him from Dracula? Yeah. He's in this film now, And this was very much the film that I think sort of made him. So at least he broke him through to a wider audience, And he was in it, like I say, he was in a lot of stuff beforehand, but this was his biggie. And we never looked back. I think he did. I think he was a little perturbed by people kept bringing up Dracula. Though having said that, I was working once at a signing that he was giving, and he never balked at people bringing Dracula stuff in to sign. He was quite happy to sign it. He was much happier if you talked about Jinnah, or if you talked about, Lord of the Rings was being made at that time, Star Wars. He'd be much happier if he came and talked about those, because his argument was always, I'm not just Dracula.
Yes.
I've done an awful lot more. And that's fair enough. I can get that. Of course, spots like me keep turning up and going, oh, hello, Mr. Lee. Can you tell us all about Dracula? And he just probably got really sick of it after a while, But
and do you think that, you've mentioned already that his subsequent films that he's in as Dracula, he does less and less, right, as it goes on, and he has less and less to say. Is that because he wasn't fussed about doing it, or is it the other way around? Is it that he got increasingly pissed off because he was given so little to do in those films?
He always maintained that. I think it's Dracula, Prince of Darkness, isn't it? It's the one where he doesn't say anything at all. And he always maintained that the dialogue was so awful, I refused to say it. It's nonsense. It's, you see the scripts and he doesn't have any dialogue. It was a decision that was made that sometimes, sort of the non-talking monsters are the scariest. And it was what they did. And I can understand he was getting a bit pissed off towards the end. I love Taste the Blood of Dracula, but when, the bulk of his dialogue is him just reeling off the first, the second, the third, for every victim. You kind of think, I can get it, you poor guy. I can get where you're coming from. Because he was a big fan of the novel. And I think he saw Dracula as being far more powerful than, this guy that's skulking around in the dark. I think that is very powerful, to be honest. I think his quietness and he's sort of being in the background, he's actually quite creepy. I think it's quite scary. There's a great scene in Satanic Rites of Dracula where Van Helsing goes to see D.D. Denham, the property developer who's built on the... the fact that he's called D.D. Denham, I mean, come on, Lorimer, you should have spotted that one a mile away, shouldn't you? But it turns out he's Dracula. And of course, he's sitting there, the first time we see him, he's sitting there in the dark in his office. And that's kind of, that kind of is Dracula to me. He's this shadowy figure manipulating things literally from the shadows, from the darkness, so I can see from an actor's point of view that it wasn't great, was it, not having so much to say, but from a viewer's point of view I didn't mind it so much. But it's a sort of blessing and a curse for him, I suppose, that his pure demeanor, like, he doesn't have to do anything in order to be so scary, and because of that they don't need him to do much. It's just like, just Christopher, just go and stand there, you'll do everything we need you to do, basically. In my mind, and this will seem like a strange analogy at first, he's a bit like Eric Morecambe. Eric Morecambe never had to do anything. He just had to look at you and you started to laugh. And Christopher Lee was the horror equivalent. He didn't have to do anything. And again, it was that stillness that I mentioned earlier, where you could just see him looking at you, thinking unthinkable thoughts.
Yes.
We never really knew what was going on in that head of his, and he did it so well, that he kind of, in a way, a victim of his own success. He was so damn good at it, So good. Good. And I think it's interesting as well, the level of monstrousness, I suppose, of Dracula in this one. We've talked about already Nosferatu, obviously Count Orlok being very monstrous, Yes.
And then Bella, being very human in comparison, really doesn't even have fangs, right?
That's
Whereas
right,
this one, we're somewhere in between, aren't we? Again, like you say, we've got this suave sex appeal, but also he has fangs in this, right? And he's genuinely a monster, There's blood, but he's charming. When he first meets Harker, although there is, and I've talked about this a lot, there is a wonderful scene where Harker goes up the steps and he struggled in with his cases, and Dracula just picks him up and pretty much emasculates Harker by striding up the steps two at a time, while poor Harker's like scurrying along like a little schoolboy behind him. This is a beautiful little shot, and I've no idea if that was in the script or if that was something that Lee thought of, because he was so tall he could take these steps two at a time. It's a beautiful shot because it really shows that you come to my home, but I'm the alpha male here. I'm bigger than you. I'm stronger than you. I'm better than you. I'm sexier than you. Don't mess with me. And it's so subtly done. I think in a modern film, they'd have someone talking about that for 10 minutes. Whereas in this film, it was just like they hadn't got 10 minutes to spare, so they just did it. And if people noticed it, they noticed it. If they didn't, they didn't. Yeah, you're right. And it's the way that he sort of appears to, and Christopher Lee, again, does this naturally, I think, but he appears to sort of glide when he walks, doesn't he?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Even in The Wicker Man, he does that a little bit. It's almost like he sort of floats about, Christopher Lee.
He had a fascinating movement, didn't he? A fascinating walk. I remember reading that Cubby Broccoli had said of Sean Connery that he knew that he was going to be Bond because of the way he walked. And I think with Lee, he had that sort of, because he's very upright and very sort of, composed. And then he moved, and you could kind of almost film him from the waist up, and he didn't appear to be using his legs. And in case of Dracula, that is superb. That is so, so good.
Perfect,
he brings a real physicality to the role that I think even Bela Lugosi didn't manage, to be honest.
I agree. And actually, speaking of, let's talk a little bit about what kind of a Dracula we have here as well, because I think the other interesting thing is the way people pick and choose what kind of vampire rules they apply to their Dracula, right? We don't, as far as I recall, or am I wrong, but we don't see him sort of transform into animals in this one or anything, do we?
No, there's no animal transformation at all in this one. And, Van Helsing goes to great lengths to point this out. He's recording a diary on newfangled phonograph.
Yes.
And which, in a way is actually quite an interesting point, because he's very clearly a man of science.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
He has his Christian beliefs, which, sort of propels him forward, but he's also a man of science. And he's clearly using the latest technology to record his adventures, as it were, to keep his diary. Yes. And he does mention, he goes to great lengths to say it's a myth that vampires turn into bats and wolves. And immediately in the next film, they throw that away, and we see the first appearance of Dracula's rather ropey rubber bat, which will turn up looking scabbier and scabbier in each film. But
yes, that's interesting, isn't it? But and sunlight. Sunlight is the thing that kills him ultimately at the end of this film, right? Isn't it? And again, that's actually not something that's sort of present in the novel. No. In the novel, he's able to actually walk around during the day, but he's a bit weakened, right? Whereas, and then I think it's Nosferatu obviously has that famous ending where opening the curtains and he dissolves, right? So it's really interesting to see different films, what they kind of pick and choose to use for, their kind of vampire rules and everything.
Indeed. And I think, the current generation of vampire filmmakers have got a lot to choose from.
Yes.
So they're taking elements from Nosferatu, from Dracula, the Universal, from the Hammer one, from the Gary Oldman one, from whatever else they've grown up watching, And so now we've sort of arrived at this point where, vampires are very different to what they were in 1957 when this was made.
Yeah.
So, it's a very different world now.
Let's talk about the brilliant Peter Cushing, shall we? Because I think people, again, I always think of these movies as being Christopher Lee movies, and I sort of forget really that like you said, Peter Cushing was their star, right? He was their headliner name, and what a tremendous actor, right? He's just incredible.
He's my favourite actor of all time.
Yeah,
I absolutely adore him. He was known, he had this sort of nickname of Props Peter, because he would, when he got his script, he would make a note of where everything was on the set, where the set dressings were, so he could go over and start fiddling with things. So, if he was a scientist, he knew where all the test tubes were, so he can go up and have a shake of a test tube while he's talking. There was none of that just standing there delivering the lines. He wanted to make the character feel real. And so, he was constantly fiddling with a stopwatch or, cleaning his glasses or something, just those little details which we miss. But, you'd miss them even more if he wasn't doing them. And he's so good in this. He's so authoritative. And there's kind of there's an almost frightening calmness about him. He's obsessed with finding and killing Dracula. He's almost as monstrous as Dracula himself in some ways because of that sort of obsessiveness. He could be quite short with people. He could be quite rude to the people around him. When we'd seen Van Helsing in the Universal film played by Edward Van Sloan, he was rather a fusty old academic.
Yes.
Whereas in this, he's a much younger man. He's a much more athletic man. He's a man of learning. He likens vampirism to drug addiction, which I think is possibly the first time that we'd actually heard that. And, he's very modern. He's very up to date. He's very current. And, that athleticism, particularly in that final shot, is just it's like a million miles away from dear old Edward Van Sloan. It's just completely different reading of Van Helsing. And, of course, that just makes them both him and Lee sort of play off each other brilliantly throughout. The performances sort of egg each other on almost, to sort of see who can be better, who can be scarier, who can be more authoritative, It's wonderful.
I know. I love watching the two of them together, actually. And it's part of the reason why I guess actually thinking about the 4 movies that I'm actually covering in depth across this era is this, Brides, AD 72 and Satanic Rites. So I'm kind of covering the Peter Cushing ones more than I am the Christopher Lee ones, actually. But, I love seeing him on screen and him go up against Christopher Lee in these movies as well, There was some great sort of, Van Helsing stand-ins in the other films, superb performances, great characters, but it really did come to life when you saw the two of them together on screen. There was, that's not just in the Hammer films, there was real chemistry between them. I don't know how much, sort of people will often say, oh yeah, they were such good friends. I don't know whether they were sort of, down the pub with each other on a Saturday night. I think they liked each other immensely and they spent a lot of time when they were working together. But there was definitely a genuine respect and affection, I think, between them. And I think they just got to the point where they kind of knew what each other was going to do when they got to the film. They'd read the script and they thought, oh yes, Chris will do this, Pete will do that. And that's it. And that's got to be a good feeling for an actor to turn up knowing pretty much half your job's done because you've got this fantastic sparring partner. And I think you feel like with both of them, but Peter Cushing as well, especially as the leader, you're in safe hands when you watch him, right? Like you just feel safe that he's going to do an amazing job no matter what, I think. you know?
You'd follow this Van Helsing into no matter what.
Yes.
You know, if he said to you, there's a horde of vampires up there in that castle, we're going to go and kill them, you go, yeah, all right, okay, let's go. Give you a crucifix, we're off. You know, because you just totally trust him because he's, like I say, there's that calmness. Again, there's a kind of stillness about him. And he's just so calm, so collected. He knows what he's talking about. He's an academic, he's a scientist, and you just totally believe him. You know, if he says everything's going to be all right, you'll believe it, and he will make it right, you know?
Yeah, and he, and like you say, I think because of Peter Cushing being the leading man, it does feel like the film has been engineered to be more about Van Helsing, right? And we get to we meet Van Helsing so much sooner. Like you've mentioned, that brilliant moment, really brilliant reveal where Jonathan is writing a letter to Van Helsing about Dracula, and it turns out they're working together. All of that is a great decision, I think, as well, that you've got this kind of hero and villain set up from the start, really, you know?
It is. Yeah. It's almost like oh, the Gothic fans are going to hate me for this. It's almost like a sort of superhero thing, isn't it?
Yes.
You've got the sort of the superhero and his arch nemesis, his arch villain. You know,
I guess that's why we ended up with. I guess that's why we end up with Hugh Jackman as Van Helsing. You know, 50 years later.
Yeah, well, I love Hugh Jackman, but the less said about that, the better. Really, I think. Let's move on. Let's move on. Yeah, but I think there is a sense in this film that they've been after each other for a very long time. You know, so this isn't Van Helsing first finding out about Dracula. He knows about Dracula. It feels like there's, many an untold story going on before this film.
Yes.
And, we never find out quite why Van Helsing hates Dracula with the passion that he does, quite apart from the fact that he's, a dead blood-sucking leech, which is probably enough, to be fair. But, we never find out if there's any personal motivation. We just have to take it on trust that it's been there all that time, you know?
Between the hours of sunset and sunrise, all the windows in her room, with the possible exception of a small fanlight for ventilation, must be kept shut.
Oh, but Dr. Stewart
Mrs. Holmwood, you called me in for a second opinion. If I am to help your sister-in-law, there are certain things you must do to help me. However unorthodox they may appear.
Yes, I know, but...
Madam, if you love Miss Lucy, be guided by me, I beg you.
I'll do anything to make her well again.
No. You must get some garlic flowers, as many as you can. Place them by her windows and her door and by her bedside. They may be taken out during the day, but under no circumstances, even if the patient implores you, must they be removed at night. I cannot impress upon you strongly enough how important it is that you obey my instructions. Do exactly as I say, and we may be able to save her. If you don't, she will die.
Maybe by this point, because we've had the Universal movies, because the novel has been out for a long time, it does kind of almost assume that people know this story, and that's why it's really fun to play with it, right? It's like, okay, we're going to subvert those expectations, because a lot of people, I'm sure, going to see this even in 1958 probably knew this story, right? And knew what they were in for. Yeah.
They knew that we're going to get, and that's why the Harker Van Helsing connection works, because it subverts what we think is going to actually happen here. This is not the sort of the Harker or the Renfield as it was in the Universal film, but it's not the Harker of the book. It's there's a very different relationship between him and Van Helsing, which is such a surprise. It does come as a sort of, oh wow, there's two vampire hunters in this, and then you realise actually this guy's he's the hero. He's come to kill Dracula. Oh my God, he's dead in a coffin. And all of a sudden nobody's safe. It's a brilliant bit of writing. Jimmy Sangster deserves so much more credit for all this stuff that he sometimes gets.
Yeah,
brilliant.
And the last thing I want to say about Peter Cushing as well is that I think he's a bit like Christopher Lee, does a lot with very little. Like, I think he's got tremendous eyes, doesn't he? And like, he, with a flicker of his eyes or a slight movement in his face, he says a hell of a lot, doesn't he? And I think that's another great thing about him.
Very soulful eyes. He could tell a whole story with those eyes. And then if the story wasn't quite getting across, there was, of course, the Cushing finger. We've all seen the Cushing finger when he sort of points and sort of gives it a slight waggle.
Yes.
It's like just to make his point. And it was, it's much loved amongst Peter Cushing fans is the Cushing finger. You'd see it. You kind of wait for it. It's a bit like a sort of Hitchcock cameo. You wait for it to turn up, And, but this is all part of his technique, this idea that he knew how to use props. He knew how to use the set. He knew how to express things with his eyes. And, this is the sign of a school of acting, I think, that's long gone, I'm afraid. We don't see actors like these guys anymore. You know, it's such a shame. Such a shame.
Yeah, and the other interesting thing about Hammer, I think, is that it does tend to skew towards slightly older men, right? Like a lot of our leading characters are sort of men in their 40s upwards a lot of the time, aren't they? And that's kind of interesting and actually quite unusual for the horror genre. I think what's quite interesting when we talk about Brides of Dracula is that there are a few more interesting women in that film. But with a lot of these movies, it is like, I guess that maybe that all changes with, films like Rosemary's Baby and Jamie Lee Curtis in Halloween or whatever, but it feels like they become more female skewed. Whereas Hammer movies are, they're more sort of middle-aged men, aren't they, at the leading roles, which is interesting.
But of course, they were written and made by largely middle-aged men, so of course, and then when they did try to skew younger, as in, AD 72, which, again, I love, don't get me wrong, I absolutely bloody love it. I mean, honest to God, I'm an old hippie, and I wasn't, I was only 10 in 1972, but for God's sake, I knew hippies, I knew people like that. None of them spoke like that.
So good. I love it.
None of them. He's fantastic. But, clearly, and this was common in a lot of British horror films of the 70s, that, they were trying to write for the kids.
Yes.
And they'd clearly never met one.
Yes.
They'd seen a couple of TV programmes on the BBC about, sort of Chelsea, and thought this is what every teenager in the country looked like. They all looked like they were 25 and they were all saying the same things, no. But you still love them because they're still great.
We love them. Let me ask you a bit about the Terence Fisher, the director. Now, he is generally, right, Kev, regarded as one of the top Hammer directors, I believe, right?
The top Hammer director. Yeah, there were some really great directors at Hammer, but it was Terence Fisher. He's the boss. He's the man. He was part of that original setup. That part of the family, that little family of filmmakers that made these things. And what's really interesting, and there's nothing in his filmography really to suggest prior to Curse of Frankenstein that he had this in him.
Right.
And, there were no horror films. He didn't even particularly like horror. I don't think he didn't dislike it, but he wasn't going down the Odeon on a Saturday night to check out the latest American horror movie. He referred to his films sometimes as fairy tales.
That's interesting.
They weren't horror to him. They were, and it gives lie to a claim that I hear sort of rather depressingly too frequently from a lot of fans, that only a fan can make a good horror film. And that's nonsense. These guys weren't fans. They were making their own subgenre of horror. And it was just something that clicked. Just they gave the script to Terence Fisher. He looked at it and a little light went on in his head and thought, I can do this. I get this. I understand this. And, those original Gothics that he made are still some of the best horror films you'll ever see. The Mummy, Hound of the Baskervilles, all that sort of stuff. They're fantastic, brilliant film. And of course, he went right through almost to the very end. He finished off the Frankenstein series when he came back, and he did Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell, which is a fantastic film, a really good film. So, he was kind of beginning and end, certainly, of the Frankenstein films. There was, more horror films to come, but this was, of that period of Hammer, that sort of golden age of Hammer. He was kind of bookending that. And it was just something, I don't know, he just seemed to find something in the Gothic inspired him. And he just made the most amazingly beautiful horror films. They were beautiful films. They look gorgeous. Really gorgeous.
Like you say, you can kind of bathe in the set design and the production design and the props. One of the things I noticed watching it again, in nice, crisp Blu-ray, is that there's a moment when Dracula is talking to Jonathan in the bedroom and you can see their breath. You can actually see the coldness of their breath. And I think that's a lovely little touch that I'd never really noticed before this rewatch. But, there are little details like that look amazing.
I mean, I've not really known if that was by accident or by design. I guess the studio was just very cold, but it works brilliantly. I'd like to think Terence Fisher thought, actually, this is a man who's technically dead.
Yeah.
But, he wouldn't feel the cold, so he would have his castle cold. And sort of, living human beings, you can go hang themselves. This is my castle. I keep it at my temperature. I'd like to think that was on his mind. I don't know. I don't know whether it was just a happy, because Bray was probably a very cold studio, I would think.
Oh, my God.
But, it doesn't matter. It works. That's the thing. It doesn't matter. A lot of times in films, horror films and otherwise, it's the accidental thing.
Yeah.
that really gives it the little boost. You know, the thing that they hadn't intended will suddenly make it into something just a little bit extra special.
Now, as well as how this film looks, let's talk about how this film sounds, because another thing that, we've talked about with Bela Lugosi's Dracula, Todd Browning's Dracula, is that there's basically no score, right? Really?
No.
And that's another very strange thing about it, that it almost feels like obviously we're in that transition between silent cinema and sound there. Whereas with this, oh my God, do we have a big score?
I mean, in the Universal one, you get a brief burst of Swan Lake at the beginning.
Yes, that's right.
And when I first saw it, I had no idea what Swan Lake was, to be honest. I just loved this bit of music. It was really, really great. And ever since then, I've associated it with vampires, not with swans.
Yeah.
It's really odd. But anyway, here we get James Bernard, who was, again, one of that sort of original gang of creators that sort of started the Hammer Gothics. And it's absolutely brilliant. I mean, he's thunderous at times. It is absolutely the perfect accompaniment. And what's best about it is he actually creates a kind of theme song for Dracula. You get these motifs, dun dun dun, Dracula.
Dun, dun, dun,
and he said this in an interview that he's actually the three syllables of Dracula's name, dun dun dun. And that was his little theme song that whenever he came along, and, it became instantly recognisable in later films. Once you heard that, you knew Dracula was about, and, But what a magnificent score. It really, and again, James Bernard was, such a key player in those early Gothics. The music, nowadays we'd probably look at it and go, it's a bit bombastic, isn't it? There's no synthesizers, there's no droning strings and all the rest of it. It wasn't. It was these lush, romantic, classical scores, and they were absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, and they work so well for making you jump as well at places, because they're so loud,
So loud, absolutely deafening. And what's beautiful about them is you can go and get the soundtrack albums and listen to them as pieces of music. And I've always thought the best, soundtrack. I love John Williams' soundtracks because you can listen to them as a separate piece of music, and they stand up as beautiful, well-structured pieces of music in their own right. And it's the same with these Hammer Gothics. You listen to the soundtracks on their own, and they are glorious pieces of music.
Yeah, wonderful. I did find, though, when I was watching it, I live in a terraced house, and I would turn up the volume to hear the dialogue, and I'd suddenly have to turn it down because the music would be tremendously loud all of a sudden. I'd jump out of my skin, but it's great. Well, it's really great.
Old farts like me constantly complain about bloody new films because, they're like, there's always so loud. Blah, blah, blah. But you're right. I mean, these films were, the soundtrack was turned up to 15, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. It was.
But that was part of the effect. That was why they were so good. That's what put you on edge. It's brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. So there you go. Any other moments? I mean, there's probably so much we can talk about with this film. We've already been talking. We've got a whole other film to discuss yet.
We've got a whole other film. I know. Sorry, I'm keeping you up here, aren't I?
No, I love it. There's so much to cover. But is there anything else that's any other sort of standout scenes or moments for you that we haven't mentioned there that you want to sort of mention or discuss?
I think I've mentioned the three big bits that always strike me. It's Dracula's first appearance, and he was going up the stairs. Absolutely love that. The scene with the woman, the vampire woman, which is still scary. It's very difficult to say whether a film that's 60 years old can still be scary.
Yeah.
But there are moments in Dracula which are. That sudden jump cut, that snarling close-up, that snarling face, absolutely brilliant. Absolutely textbook example of how to make someone jump with a horror film. And of course the ending, which is just, and if you've got the more recent Blu-rays, you'll have seen the restored version of it, which features the footage that they found in the Japanese film archive. Much grislier, much nastier, much more detail on the the crumbling away and the mouldering horribleness of it all. And it's even more powerful in that version. But I mean, to be honest, the best bit of Dracula is the bit that starts at around 2 seconds in and finishes just as the words "the end" come up. That's the best bit of Dracula. It is absolutely brilliant.
Oh, I love it. Well, there you go. And let me ask you, I'm guessing this movie was a big hit, was it? I mean, did this kind this kind of partly, I guess, it responsible for that huge boom of Gothic horrors that we were about to get from Hammer, I suppose?
Well, I mean, Curse of Frankenstein had been huge and had been massive. And in fact, the first indication we had that Hammer were thinking about doing Dracula was James Carreras, who was the managing director at the time, wrote to his American contact sort of saying how brilliantly Curse of Frankenstein was doing at the box office, and that they were working on this new film, Blood of Frankenstein, which would become Revenge of Frankenstein.
Yeah.
And it ends with a PS in capital letters, Dracula, 3 question marks. And so as soon, Curse of Frankenstein is still in the cinemas coining in the money, and they're already thinking, where do we go now? And so, and I think this did consolidate it. I think Curse of Frankenstein was what made Hammer. This is what actually sort of boosted them along. They thought, right, we've had 2 for 2 here. Let's keep going with this. Revenge of Frankenstein was already in production at this point, and it just snowballed from there. For the next 10 years, they were brilliant. They reigned supreme.
Hello, everyone. Before we get into the second half of this week's episode, just going to take a moment to thank this week's sponsor. That's $20 Patreon subscriber, Dark Lord Chuckles. I think his actual name is Mike, but to avoid confusion, because too many Mikes, right? Let's go with Dark Lord Chuckles. I love it. A huge thank you to Dark Lord Chuckles, and I just want to read this little message from him that he sent me. Hi, Mike. Just a quick note to say thanks for all the podcasts. I'm really happy to have been able to up my patronage. I don't have anything of my own to promote, so I'd like to ask that my daughter's podcast gets a mention. It's called Berry's Couch, and it's 2 friends who happen to be an autistic and English major sit down and discuss media, film, and whatever they need to justify a degree. It's all available on all the usual podcast places. Thank you so much to Dark Lord Chuckles, and I have hit subscribe on my podcast app right now. I am very much looking forward to giving that a listen. So for any of you out there, if you need any more film, media discussion podcasts to listen to, check out Berry's Couch. That's spelled BERRI''S, Berry's Couch, and you can find that in all the usual podcast places. Once again, a huge thank you to this week's sponsor. That's $20 Patreon subscriber, Dark Lord Chuckles. And if you want to become an Evolution of Horror sponsor and get your own little dedicated segment like this one in an upcoming episode, then you simply need to subscribe to our Patreon at a $20 per month level. Patreon.com/Evolution of Horror. That was a little clip you just heard there from a new Finnish horror movie by filmmaker Hanna Bergholm called Hatching. Now, this movie received hugely glowing reviews at Sundance. It always feels like every year at Sundance there's one horror movie that kind of shines through that people talk about. There were a number of great horror movies at this year's Sundance, but Hatching was certainly one of the movies that people were very excited about. And if you're in London, you're in luck, because you not only get the chance to come and see that film, but you may also get the chance to come and see me chat to the director and a couple of other horror filmmakers on stage, because this month is Sundance Film Festival in London. That's a little mini version of Sundance Film Festival, and it's held right here in Picture House Central in London, in which they show some of the best and most acclaimed movies from the festival, all across 2 or 3 days. And on the Saturday, the 11th of June, I'm going to be hosting a very special panel. At 7 p.m, I'm going to be joined by the director of Hatching, that's Hanna Bergholm. I'm also going to be joined by the director of another scary psychological horror thriller playing at Sundance called Resurrection. The director of that, Andrew Siemens, he's going to be joining me, and also I'm going to be joined by one of the most interesting horror filmmakers working of this decade, the brilliant Babak Anvari, director of Wounds and Under the Shadow. So these 3 filmmakers are going to be joining me for a very special live podcast discussion on stage in front of an audience. We're going to be talking about some of the greatest horror moments, some of their scariest moments, some of the greatest scares, and the secret to creating and making a successful horror movie. It's going to be a kind of horror masterclass in which I chat to these three about their horror inspirations. So if you want to grab yourself a very special ticket to this horror cinema discussion with three very talented horror filmmakers, then get involved. You can head on over to evolutionofhorror.com/Sundance, and that should redirect you straight to the ticket page where you can pick up your live podcast discussion ticket. That's on Saturday, the 11th of June at Picture House Central in London. evolutionofhorror.com/Sundance. Okay, let's head into the second half of this week's episode, in which Kevin Lyons and I discuss the first sequel in the Hammer Horror Dracula series, and it's very different to the previous entry. So this is Brides of Dracula from 1960.
Listen to the beat of your heart, Marianne. You hear the beat of fear within you? Fear that will rise to a shattering crescendo of terror. You have strayed into a world of evil, where frightened people are held in the grip of unearthly horror. Beware of pity for the handsome prisoner in the Castle Meister. Beware of love, for in your heart is only the pulsating throb of terror.
Starring Peter Cushing as the Doctor locked in mortal combat with overwhelming evil.
So, Kev, again, set the scene for us. Tell us what this movie's all about.
Well, the scene is actually set by a rather good voiceover, and we get a little flashback to the ending of Dracula. And this voiceover tells us Count Dracula, monarch of all vampires, is dead. But his disciples live on to spread the cult and corrupt the world. And that's really what it's about. Dracula doesn't appear in this film. I don't think we've ever really got to the bottom of why Christopher Lee is not in it, whether it was Hammer that didn't ask him back, or he was too busy, or he didn't want to come back. I don't think we've ever really got to the bottom of that. But Dracula's no longer in it. Van Helsing is still in it. The new vampire is a chap called Baron Meinster, played by David Peel, who is being kept chained up in his castle by his mother, the Baroness, played brilliantly by Martita Hunt. And she's employed this young woman, Marianne Danielle, Yvonne Monlaw, who's going to come along. She's a young French school teacher. She's been employed to work at a local school, in fact, and she ends up staying in the house, in the castle, overnight. And Meinster is such a little shit, I have to say. He's a horrible little git, that he charms her with this, oh, poor me, take pity on me, I'm all chained up, they think I'm mad story. And she lets him free. And of course, she has no idea he's a vampire. And he's one of the, Dracula's disciples. So Marianne frees him, and he's soon on the rampage, and Van Helsing has to come again and sort of, sort the problem out as he always does. And there's, like you said, there are a lot more women in this film than there are in the first one. They're a bit more decorous in the first film, by which I mean they're more as decoration rather than anything else. Here, they're playing very central parts in the film, and not just young women in various states of undress, but actually sort of older women getting really good parts in this film as well.
Yeah.
But it's all about Van Helsing, and it's like he's killed Dracula, and so his mission is done, but then he realised, no, he's not.
Yes.
This corruption is still out there. His malign influence is still abroad in the world, even though I've killed him. And that sense of, oh my God, it's still going on. Will I ever get to rest because I've now got to get rid of all these vampires as well?
Yes.
It's a wonderful twist on the story, really.
It is, actually. This was, and you're a huge fan of this one, Kev, aren't you? Isn't this one?
Oh
of your
yeah,
faves?
Absolutely. In some ways, it might even be better than the original. And the original is always going to be my favourite because it's it's the first, and I love it. But there are things in this film which I think they're just absolutely amazing.
Yeah, I loved it as well. This was the first time I'd seen it, and I really loved it. And I think if I had one complaint, and don't hang up on me, Kev, but
Sure.
it would be that I loved the first act so much that I almost wish we'd stayed there rather than what the film ends up kind of becoming. Like I loved every moment of that school teacher meeting the Baroness, this man across the way that she was trying to rescue, and when we're in that castle, I think it's so good. And I kind of loved that section more than what follows it, I suppose. But I still had such a great time with the film all the way through. It was really, really great, and just such great characters in this one, I think.
Well, Mike, as ever, I hear what you're saying, and as ever, you're bloody wrong. No, no, I take your point. It does change dramatically, doesn't it? As sort of halfway through, it becomes a slightly different film.
Yeah,
and to be honest, I love both parts of it, I must admit, both ends of it. But yes, I agree, all those scenes set in the castle at the beginning, when we're not sure who or what Meinster is, we're kind of almost led to believe that maybe his mother, the Baroness, might be the vampire. We're not quite sure who's who, what's going on.
Well, I think because the title of the film, I think I was misled maybe into thinking that this would be about a female vampire, as the main antagonist rather than this Baron Meinster. So I was all ready for this scary Baroness to be the villain of the film, which he is.
You weren't misled, you were played.
Yes,
and brilliantly.
Yes.
This is Hammer knew what they were doing. And of course, it refers to the fact that there are female vampires in the film.
Yeah,
but it is. I'm sure it was at the back of their minds to think, let's call it this, and let's see how long it takes them to realise. Oh, hang on a minute, it's not the women at all. It's that horrible bloke, isn't it?
I know it's excellent, isn't it? But actually, one of my favourite moments in the whole film, in all of the Hammer Dracula films I've seen, is that moment when the woman is I've forgotten her name, but it's the woman that's talking to the newly born vampire coming out of the earth, right?
It's the maid, Frida Jackson.
That's it, Frida Jackson. Frida Jackson's incredible in this.
Mate, and her and Martita Hunt, who plays the Baroness, they're these older women in the cast. They are staggeringly good.
Yeah.
Martita Hunt gets this wonderful moment where she's been vampirised by her son. Sorry, there should have been a spoiler. We'll stick a spoiler warning on the beginning.
We'll stick it at the beginning.
But she's been vampirised by her son as revenge. I mean, this is what's so horrible about it. He took his revenge on her for chaining him up by turning her into a vampire, the one thing she was dreading.
Yes.
And there's a wonderful moment where Van Helsing confronts her, and he kind of, out of an act of kindness, he kills her.
Yeah.
Because he knows that she doesn't want to be. And it's a beautiful performance by Martita Hunt. Yeah. Frida Jackson, when she's out in that graveyard, and she's got this mad-eyed sort of midwife trying to, coax the baby out of the ground almost, it's terrifying. It's really scary. And those two performances, they're the ones in the film that come closest to actually knocking Peter Cushing out of the frame, because they are so good.
No, I can't help you. You've got to be strong. What? Yes, I know it's dark, but you've got to push. Yes. Push. That's right. Push. Now. Just one little effort more. You'll soon be here. Come now. Come, my precious. That's right. Come, my little love. There, the master's waiting for you. There she is. She comes. There's my little beauty. The clever one.
They're so good. Big performances, particularly Frida, right?
Yeah.
I love them. I absolutely love them. And I love that kind of, I guess it is very gothic, almost a kind of flip of something like Jane Eyre or something like even, or it reminded me a bit of the old Dark House. I love that setup of the idea of like, there's somebody locked in a room somewhere in this place.
Yes.
I think that's always such a great setup for a gothic story like this.
It's a gothic staple, isn't it? So the mad woman in the attic sort of thing. Only this time it's a kind of a suave but sort of dangerous vampire that's locked
right,
up
and there is definitely that kind of sexual attraction element too, right? I mean, I'm imagining that our main heroine is kind of likes the look of him too, right? Which is another reason why she's kind of fooled into really, into going over there and freeing him. Yeah,
it's a handsome blonde-haired guy. You don't think that vampires are going to be handsome blonde-haired guys. You think they're going to be sort of tall and dark and all the rest of it. But he doesn't look like your traditional vampire. He looks quite boyish in a way. And of course, that again is them pulling the rug from under us. We don't expect it to be him, And brilliantly done.
And I guess the big elephant in the room of this is that for a film with Dracula in the title, there is no Dracula. There is no Christopher Lee, right? And how do you find that? Do you find that you miss him? Do you miss Christopher Lee in this?
In fairness, I miss Christopher Lee in virtually everything, to be honest. There's a joke, isn't there, that you could take John McClane from Die Hard and put him in any film and the film instantly gets 100 times better. I think the same with Christopher Lee. You could put him in anything, and the films just automatically would be better by his presence. So yes, of course we miss him, but in a way, no. So I think David Peel is sometimes he's he hasn't always had the best reputation among some of the fans. I think he's pretty good, to be honest. Yeah. I think he's pretty sinister. He's pretty scary, and really, it's about the influence of Dracula rather than Dracula himself. Dracula's gone. Dracula's dead. And, maybe they weren't sure that they could keep up a series with the same character. Maybe they weren't sure that could happen. But, they were trying something different. And I think it's all about his malign influence in the world. That, he may be gone, but you suddenly realise, actually, he's been up to no good. Even before the first film, he's been vampirising God knows how many people. And they're all still out there somewhere. And they need mopping up, And there could have been, in an alternative universe, there could have been a whole series of Van Helsing films rather than Dracula films. Yeah. Where Peter Cushing remained, the main character, but fought a different vampire every time because he was just travelling around Europe, basically cleaning up Dracula's mess. Yeah. So, that could have been a very different way that it develops. It didn't. We got what we got, and I'm very happy with that. But it could have been this other alternative storyline, really. Yeah, and I love this. I love this storyline. I think it works really well, and it's great. And it's I think what really works is that we do get Van Helsing back. I mean, that's what really ties it to the original, doesn't it? I think. Yeah. And again, what a pleasure, right, to see him back, Peter Cushing back as Van Helsing in this movie. And he's more obsessed than ever, isn't he? Yes. He's more terrified. There's that wonderful scene in it, probably after the birthing of the vampire woman scene. It'll be the scene most people remember, is when the unthinkable happens and he gets bitten. Yes. And he cauterizes his own wound with a red hot branding iron. That's great. Honestly, that performance is absolutely staggering. And you can feel that pain. You can feel the panic that Van Helsing must be feeling, that, oh my God, I'm going to become the thing I hate the most. And there's that moment of absolute panic, and Cushing plays it. I mean, there's no point me saying Cushing played it brilliantly. Cushing played everything brilliantly. But yeah, in this case, it is particularly good. It's particularly effective. Do you think that sort of directorially, obviously we've got Terence Fisher back again. He's done a lot of films in the interim, right, between Dracula and this already. Like you've mentioned already, Hound of the Baskervilles, Revenge of Frankenstein, The Mummy. Has anything kind of changed or grown in the kind of style of Hammer filmmaking and Terence Fisher's directing that you notice in this? I think you could feel a bit more confidence coming from him in this film. Like I said, he hadn't really got form in horror before Dracula. I'm not saying Dracula is not a confident film, and my God, it is. The direction in it is absolutely first rate. But this kind of feels like Terence Fisher sort of stretching out a little bit, trying different things, trying new ideas. And I think by this stage, the Gothics were so well established that they could kind of start to experiment a bit. And Fisher was thinking, okay, let's see what else we can do with this. I can try different lighting, I can try different set design, I can try different whatever. And sort of, all the team as usual rose to the occasion admirably. Yeah. And made, I think, possibly one of the most beautiful looking of all of the Hammers. I mean, Hammer films did tend to be gorgeous looking films, but this is one of the most beautiful. He has got that kind of almost fairy tale feel to it. It does, doesn't it? Yeah. It's very otherworldly. It's a lovely looking film. And I think that comes from the confidence that he had. He'd had these hits very quickly. I mean, we are talking 2 years. It's amazing how many they crammed into that gap. It's amazing. And, like I said at the start, it's not a derogatory thing to say they were a production line, they were a factory. They weren't a production line turning out inferior knockoff copies. They were turning out the real thing, and it was brilliantly done, and it's so well maintained for so long. Just fantastic. That confidence that must have come with knowing that we're doing the right thing. We've been hitting the public where it hurts, and they're loving it, and they keep coming back and back and back. And so you can feel there's a newfound confidence and a newfound, almost a bit of a strut to it. Yes. Like, hey, look what we can do now. This is amazing. Yeah, absolutely. And really take you on some kind of some twists and turns and pull the rug out from under you with this story, I think, as well. And I guess our sort of main character, in a way, our heroine is Marianne, right, as well. Yes. The sort of school teacher. What do you think of her in the kind of leading role for this film? You see, Yvonne Monlaw, she's great. Absolutely love her.
She's great.
She manages to exude that kind of vulnerability and innocence that you kind of need in these gothic horrors. But at the same time, you know, she doesn't really take a lot of crap from anybody around her. She knows what she wants and she's going to get it. And she's great. I think she's possibly outacted by Andre Melli as Gina. I think she's fantastic. She's just, she's one of those people who's all been really good in every film she's in. She doesn't get a lot of credit for it, really, but she's fantastic in this. And of course, Marie Devereaux, who, plays the vampire that comes out of the ground, There's so many really good roles in here. I think sometimes Hammer gets a little bit of a rep, because just scantily clad women.
Yeah.
And by the time we get to the 70s, there's an element of that. Once we get to the Karnstein films and there's, no vampire is complete without a top that falls off at inconvenient moments, I think in these earlier films, and particularly this one, this is actually, the women in this are much more interesting than they were in any of the other Hammer films of the time, and possibly even later, to be honest. It's I
think again, going back to the Baroness, Martita Hunt, she was in Great Expectations, wasn't she? She was
with Frida Jackson.
Yes, with Frida Jackson.
Yes, they were both in it. Yeah.
She's
That's
just
right.
got such a perfect face for kind of gothic storytelling.
Oh, absolutely. She's the definitive Miss Havisham, isn't she? As soon as you hear the name, even if you don't know that that's Martita Hunt, that's the face you think of. It's absolutely perfect. But her performance is stunning. That, like I say, that scene where she's confronted by Van Helsing, and she's heartbroken. She's absolutely destroyed by the fact that her son has come and done this to her. And she thought she was doing the right thing. Mm-hmm. She thought that by keeping him locked up, she'd keep everybody safe, including him.
Yeah.
And, he treated her like this. It's just, that must have struck a chord with so many mums in the audiences at the time. My ungrateful bloody son never even calls, but look at this bastard, he actually goes and turns her into a vampire,
Yeah.
And it's a beautifully played scene. And, just... They say some of it is quite large, her performance, but that scene, she really brings it back down to what really matters.
Yeah,
and it's very moving, a very moving scene.
Now, you did mention this already, but we do have the first appearance of the rubber bat, right, of the vampire bat in this one.
Hammer's rubber bats were what they were. Some of the later ones were unspeakably bad, but why they went to the trouble in the first film of establishing that vampires don't turn into bats, thus freeing themselves of the need to show us a rubber bat. And then in the next vampire film, I'll tell you what, let's get the rubber bat out. And he's like, no, you should have stuck to your guns, because it's not as bad here as it is in some of them. Some of them are shockingly bad, Scars of Dracula. But, here it's... They're never convincing. They never convinced me for 1 second that they're actually anything other than a bit of rubber on a bit of string flapping about,
Mm-hmm.
And it's a shame. It's like I say, it's a shame they needed to fall back on that. They should have stuck to their guns and actually said, no, this is what we've established. This is our new vampire mythology, and we're not going to change that. I wish they'd stuck to it, but they didn't. And so, we're stuck with it. So,
and again, the vampire kind of rules are kind of funny and interesting in this as well, because I did think the ending was quite funny and sudden when the vampire is killed by the sort of cross shadow from the windmill, right?
Yeah. Well, again, this was a different, there was going to be a different ending. And again, it was Peter Cushing said, wouldn't it be really good if we just turned the sails of the windmill around to form a crucifix, which is absolutely fine. And I love it. And I think it's a fantastically good idea, but it's one of those things where you think, well, has he never encountered a shadow of a cross before?
Yes,
he must have come across a shadow of a cross at some other point in his existence. And why did he not crumble when that happened?
Exactly. It's like, does that mean that any two lines kind of dissecting each other is going to kill a vampire, like, ever? It's like
to be honest, I mean, if you're going to look for consistency in the Hammer Draculas, it's a fool's game. They can't even keep the continuity right. But it changes. You get the scene in one of the later films where Dracula pulls the stake out of himself because it wasn't pounded in by a man who believed in God and all that sort of stuff. It's like, and I have no problem with it, I must admit, because when you're making these films one after the other, you have to do something to differentiate them. You have to keep experimenting and trying new things. The things they tried didn't always work. That's okay. I'm just really grateful that they tried, to be honest.
Yeah.
And I like the ending. I think the original ending was going to be that Van Helsing would summon up a swarm of bats that would destroy Meinster.
With sort
But,
of black
Cushing-
magic or something,
Black
right?
magic, yeah. And Cushing quite rightly said, no, Van Helsing is a man of science. He would never use black magic. That's ridiculous. It would have been a character shift right at the end, which made no sense. They reused that idea in a later film called The Kiss of the Vampire, which does feature at the end a swarm of bats being summoned up and descending upon the vampire hordes. But he's quite right. It wouldn't have worked with Van Helsing because that's not Van Helsing's way. And, in a way, this is almost using science. He's using his understanding of, shadows and the moon and relative positions and all the rest of it.
Yes.
But, yeah, it does raise the question we should never ask, sort of, how has he never encountered the shadow of a cross before?
Yeah, exactly. It's fine. We won't think about that.
We
It's
won't
fine.
go, no, don't think about it too much. No.
No, and I do like that idea that Van Helsing is more of a man of science, and it's an interesting kind of.
I mean, he has real belief. He has real strong Christian belief behind him as well, which is why he uses the crucifixes and everything. But he's a man of the new science of the time. He's probably been reading all the scientific books of the age, and he's well versed in technology, as we saw in the first film. So to suddenly become this black magician, to do some sort of ritual, just wouldn't have worked.
It's still such a great ending and great spectacle, isn't it? Like the big fire, and somebody was it Kim Newman telling me that all the best Hammer movies end in a fire and then the credits roll basically, and it's like
absolutely, yeah. If there's no fire at the end, you feel cheated. Everything has to go up in flames. But and of course, we're looking at these through relatively sophisticated eyes of modern day, 1960, when all this was still very, very new.
Yeah.
This kind of gothic horror. That would have been an absolutely blinding ending. They would have loved that. That would have been absolutely mind-blowing. So very easy to sort of sit here now after we've seen like a million horror movies and say, oh, yeah. But at the time, the context at the time, that would have been mind-blowing.
And how was this movie received in comparison to the original Dracula? I guess it also was a big hit, was it?
Very well. I mean, that's the thing. When people say how popular were the Hammer films, they kept making them.
Yes.
And they wouldn't have kept making them if people weren't going to see them. And so, it became a thing where the word Hammer became the most important thing, became more important than Dracula, Frankenstein, whoever. It was, they were like the James Bond films. They could change the James Bonds, but it didn't matter. It was still James Bond. It's like the Carry On films. We knew a different cast would appear each time, but it was the brand that was important.
Yeah.
And Hammer was the third of that great sort of trilogy of, great 60s British franchises. They were a franchise unto themselves. They had a house style, and everybody knew what they were going to get. Even when they wandered off into doing other things like the psychological horror films of the 60s, they sort of established a pattern, and people knew what to expect. They didn't get exactly what they expected because that would have been dull.
Yes.
The makers were still keeping them on their toes, but they had there was a thing about the name Hammer. It became a brand. You knew what you were going to get. You knew what to expect, and what you could expect and what you got was an incredibly good night out at the cinema. So it's a big hit.
Well, there we go. I want to ask you, like I mentioned, next week we're going to be looking in depth at AD 1972 and Satanic Rites. But there are, 3 Dracula movies in between this one and those ones, right? And I'd love to quickly ask you about those ones and fill us in. I mean, you mentioned them briefly at the beginning there, but the next one was Prince of Darkness, right?
Prince of Darkness.
And this is, and what do you think of this one? This is quite a favourite, isn't it, amongst fans?
It is. I like it. And I got into a bit of trouble when I did a whole load of reviews on my website a couple of years ago of Hammer films. So I got into a bit of trouble by saying it wasn't quite as good as the first two. And it's not quite as good as the first two. It's still a really good film. It's still an excellent film. But it's just not as good as the first two. But it is marvellous, and it's got some incredibly striking scenes in it, and Dracula's resurrection scene, the resurrection scenes would become more elaborate with each film, more outrageous and more sort of unlikely, but this is brilliant, the body's been strung up and blood poured on ashes and all the rest of it, it's fantastic.
Because of course they bring Christopher Lee back, obviously, for this one, don't they? So they bring Dracula back to life.
They either bring him back or he decides to come back. Again, I'm not sure what the story is, but this is the one where he doesn't say anything, where Dracula is silent.
Yes.
And I think it works. I think, I can understand why Christopher Lee was upset, but it works for me. I think it's quite, the fact that he doesn't feel the need to communicate with mere mortals like us. He can just sort of wander through this without even lowering himself. That's not only speaks of his vampire nature, but also his aristocratic nature. Why would he want to lower himself to talk to the plebs?
Yes, that's right.
He's out there doing his own thing, and he's the lord of all he surveys, and
no Peter Cushing in this one, though, as well. Do you miss that kind of sort of hero figure in this one?
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's why I think it's slightly less good.
Yeah.
Than the first two, because I think, I do like... Don't get me wrong. No, honestly, guys, all those of you who had a go at me on Facebook for this, I do like it, but it's not. I don't know. It's just not a favourite for some reason, and possibly it is because Peter Cushing isn't in it. However, what we do get is Father Sandor. Father Shandor, I think it's pronounced, Andrew Keir, who's another favourite actor. Love Andrew Keir. He was Quatermass in Quatermass and the Pit, which is my favourite.
The best Quatermass.
My favourite Hammer film, actually, but he did a brilliant film. And, he was so popular, in fact, that there was a marvellous magazine in the 1970s called House of Hammer, edited by Des Skin, where they did comic adaptations of the films. There was lots of news and reviews and articles and stuff. And the backup strips, they'd have shorter comic strips, and they had, Father Shandor would appear in some of them. He was popular enough to, to warrant that. But he's a good character. He's a good. I think Kim Newman calls him the savant. The savant. The sort of guy that's going to come along and he knows the ways of the world. He knows the ways of vampirism, and he's going to come and sort it all out for us. So he's a good. There's nothing wrong. Andrew Keir is brilliant. It's just not Peter Cushing. And, that's really churlish of me because, of course, it's not Peter Cushing. But, that's the way it is.
No,
Well, he's a lot better than, in the next film, Dracula Has Risen from the Grave. Again, I like it. I do like it a lot.
I've not seen this one before, but this one is the first one in the series not directed by Terence Fisher too, right? It's Freddie Francis, is that right?
It's Freddie Francis takes over at this point. Yeah, does a pretty good job of it. As a wonderful, I'm looking at it right now, there's a wonderful poster campaign from America for it. Which
Incredible.
It's a close-up of a woman's neck with two plasters on it, and the title, Dracula Has Risen from the Grave, brackets, Obviously.
Amazing. And also this poster is brilliant because it's basically just cleavage and neck, right?
Cleavage and neck. That's exactly what you can tell where Hammer were at this point, or at least their American representatives were at this point. Yeah. But, in this one, we don't have as strong an adversary for Dracula. We've got Monsignor Ernst Müller, Rupert Davis, another great actor. I really like Rupert Davis. Not quite the sort of force of nature that Van Helsing was, not quite as, frankly, terrifying as Father Shandor was,
Yes.
Quite scary, but it's still a really, really good film. Then we get Taste of Blood of Dracula, which, as I mentioned, was my first semi-taste, as it were, of Hammer Dracula. Got shunted off when they got to the brothel about 10 minutes into it. I never forgave my parents for that, frankly. I love this film. I like this one a lot. It's not everybody's favourite, but it is really good. And this is kind of the time in a way because it's Dracula, this old authority figure, preying on the young.
Okay.
So, remember that this was released in 1970. So, we were right in that whole sort of, youthful uprising sort of thing. And so this is Dracula feeding on the young more so than ever before. And he's using the young as an instrument of his revenge against the old who crossed him. And this has got the best resurrection scene ever. It's completely nuts where, the three supposedly respectable Edwardian gentlemen meet this horrible Lord Courtly, played by Ralph Bates, who's this horrible sort of libertine character, who has the dried blood of Dracula, which he pours blood into, so it all bubbles up into a liquid, and drinks it.
Ooh.
Hence tasting the blood of Dracula. And Dracula emerges from his body.
Wow.
I mean, it's nuts. It's completely mental, but it is. I love it. I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever, but it is. It is fantastic.
And does Christopher Lee sort of get much to do in this one? Does he get much kind of
this is the one where he's tending to do where, he gets the young to go and kill their fathers who crossed him, and he stands around pronouncing the first, the second. He doesn't get an awful lot more to do than that, sadly. But
yes.
And the ending is very odd. Again, spoiler alert for this one, where he gets killed by being in a church which suddenly gets re-sanctified around him.
Oh,
and it's like,
okay.
And I don't think anybody can just walk into a church, as it appears to be the case here, and say, do you know what, I'm re-sanctifying this church. I think there's probably more to it there. I'm not particularly religious, so I don't know. But it feels to me like you can't just walk into your bathroom today and say, right, I sanctify this. It's a church, you know. It feels a bit,
very strange.
Feels a bit odd. So it's an odd ending. But,
and then we get, now this is the one I can't wait to hear all your thoughts on, Kev. I haven't seen this, but Roy Ward Baker's Scars of Dracula, right, from 1970.
You want to hear my thoughts on Scars of Dracula? Well, come back tomorrow. We'll do a whole bloody episode about this steaming pile. I'm not a fan of this film. I know there are fans out there. I know I can hear them now on the Hammer Lovers on Facebook. If you're a Hammer fan and not a member of Hammer Lovers, go and join them. Great group of people. But I can hear some of them on there now. So, like, for God's sake, Lyons, this is a great film. It's not. It's terrible in almost every respect. Everything goes wrong with it. It's awful. I mean, the bats by this stage are looking particularly threadbare. But you get this bizarre scene where Dracula finds his bride in bed with another man and stabs her to death repeatedly with a knife.
Oh.
It's Dracula. Why would he do that? That
is weird.
You know, it's just horrible. And it's just, no, I really don't like it. It's got, you know, Dennis Waterman, who passed away very recently when we're recording this. He's the young hero, and I love Dennis Waterman, but he's not very good in this, to be perfectly honest. It's a problem in a lot of their films that the young leads weren't terribly interesting. But it has got Patrick Troughton in it as Clove, you know, and Michael Ripper, of course. Of course, it's got Michael Ripper in it. They've all got Michael Ripper in it. But, you know, and Christopher Lee, I don't know, you can kind of almost feel him sort of shriveling and dying inside a little bit during this one. It's like, so it kind of almost feels like Dracula AD 1972 was a film waiting to happen. It needed something. It needed a kick up the jacksie.
That's interesting. Yeah, so that movie kind of almost sort of slightly pressed the reset button on it a little bit, did it? And bring it into the modern day.
You get like a little, you know, you'll talk about this more in the main episode, but you get a little prologue set in 1872, which establishes the Dracula Van Helsing animosity, and then it jump cuts to 1972. So it does feel like, this is kind of, let's start again. You know, I have no problem with it being set in the modern day at all, because like I say, you know, the 1931 film set in what was then the modern day, and Dracula the novel is actually set in the modern day. You know, it's like when people complain about, you know, sort of Sherlock Holmes is set in the modern day. He always was. Always was set in the modern day. You know, it's just that the modern day had changed slightly, you know. But it's there were a lot of films that were moving into the modern day around this sort of time. So, you know, you were getting things like, or just about to get things like Count York, a Vampire, Blackula, films like that. And so, you know, it felt right for Dracula AD 72 to do the same for Hammer, to move it into the modern day. Yeah.
And we get Peter Cushing back in that one, don't we?
Again, and we get Peter Cushing
like
back,
you said, it's actually a really great opening sequence, isn't it? With those two kind of battling to the death. You know, it kind of starts with what would usually be a sort of third act climax, doesn't it? And
that's
it's quite fun. Yeah.
In a way, it's kind of almost like, we mentioned James Bond a couple of times, but it's almost like a Bond film. You know, where you get the end of the previous adventure that isn't really important, but it just kind of sets the scene. And then, you know, Bond's off on his mission. It's kind of like that. We get Dracula and Van Helsing fighting to the death. And you get that. I'm not going to spoil it for you. I'll allow whoever's doing next week's to spoil it for you. There's a fantastic reveal of what happens to Dracula at the end of that opening sequence, and you know the way he's dispatched the first time in the film, absolutely brilliant. But so then we get that, and then we have the main story, and it kind of feels a little bit like the way the Bond films used to have that little mini adventure at the beginning of them.
Yes. And then speaking of Bond, of course, like you've said, Satanic Rites basically just feels like Bond with Dracula, and also Christopher Lee kind of sat behind a desk at the end with a kind of slightly Eastern European accent. I was like, this is brilliant. He is full Bond villain. It's like a dry run for Scaramanga, isn't it? Or something. Is. You know?
I mean, you know, this is Dracula trying to destroy the world with a plague. I mean, this is full on, you know, sort of Bond villain stuff, or something out of Doctor Who or something. You know, it's kind of it is. I mean, it's totally different. And one of the, as I said right at the beginning, one of the hallmarks of 70s Hammer films is they didn't always get it right, but they kept experimenting. They kept trying new things. And, you know, sometimes it's very easy to be a bit sniffy at the ones that don't work and say, well, that was a bit rubbish, wasn't it? But honestly, what would you have done? You know, the world of horror was changing at the time. Hammer needed to adapt. They were trying things. Some things worked. Some things didn't. And, you know, I think the hit to miss ratio is actually pretty good. I think we got more good ones than bad ones from that period. And I will defend AD 72 and Satanic Rites to my dying breath. I think they're not great films, but they're huge fun. And that's really all you want from a film sometimes. So.
And, of course, Satanic Rites was the last one with Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, wasn't it?
It was. Then we went off and did Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires. Kung Fu, yeah. We had James Forbes Robertson in green face paint for some reason. And then, it became a Kung Fu film, which was, it's kind of fun in its own way. And it was the first glimpse in the West, I suspect, of the hopping vampires, the Jiangxi. We see a few of those in there. We'd never seen those before. So Hammer were there a decade before they became popular over in the West. That was good, but it's not a good film. It's really not a good film. It's one of those films where you're watching it, you're kind of thinking, wow, this is rubbish, but I'm kind of enjoying it on that level. But it's not one when you finish this, hopefully it's not the film you'll go and put on. You'll be listening to this thinking, I must go and watch Brides or, the original. But Legend... Maybe not. So,
it's interesting though, isn't it? I mean, really, especially in Western cinema, we haven't really had another big old Dracula series of. Obviously, we get a lot more Dracula films after this, but no more like this, right? Where you've got 9 films all kind of making a series about the character of Dracula. It's really
exactly. No, it's never happened since. No, and I don't quite know why that is, because the character is still hugely popular. I mean, you've got things like the Twilight series, which of course, is a different kind of vampire, and but they were based on books, and that was a different thing. We haven't really had, like you say, there hasn't been a series of Dracula films. I was kind of hoping that the Gatiss and Moffat thing had been slightly better. I kind of enjoyed most of it. The bits of it I didn't like, and that would have led to a kind of an ongoing, that he'd come back and we see more of. Because I thought Claes Bang was brilliant.
He was great,
fantastic,
and he got to do the sort of thing that I'm sure probably Christopher Lee would have liked to do, right? Because Claes Bang actually got to do a lot with his character.
He did, yes, yeah. Well, he gets more lines of dialogue in his first episode than I think Christopher Lee got in the entire series. To be honest, he's quite a chatty Dracula, isn't he? In that,
he is.
But I kind of hoped that it would have been, more successful, more popular, and it would have led to an ongoing series of either mini-series or television films or something. But it's very odd. I don't know why people don't make series of Dracula films. He seems like such a good metaphor for our times. This aristocratic leech that's, sort of feeding off the peasantry and the working class. It kind of, if that doesn't speak of where we are in the world at the moment, I don't know what does. So
it's true.
Yeah,
it's very, very true.
Get your fingers out, filmmakers. Come on, make a whole series of Dracula films. You want to.
I know. I'm very surprised that Jason Blum hasn't jumped on that yet, to be honest. That Blumhouse,
I'm staggered. I mean, the character is out of copyright, so, the original story isn't, but the character is. You can do what you like with it as far as I'm aware, so why not do it? But yeah, come on, Jason, I know you listen to this. Come on, you obviously you obviously hang on every word I'm saying, don't you? So come on,
come on now.
Get out there, do Dracula. You want it.
Oh, well, there we go. Well, Kev, thank you so much. What a joy it's been to listen
it's been
to
a pleasure.
Chat about Hammer Horror. This has been fantastic.
I could talk about this for weeks on end. Honestly, it's one of my great loves.
Well, I love it, and I've really enjoyed. I've been in preparation for this reading all of your pieces on your website about each of the movies, which I recommend people do. But yeah, let people know where they can find you and more of your writing and everything out there online.
Well, I've got my review website, which has got a slightly convoluted address, eofftvreview.wordpress.com.
Yes.
You can find the main website, which is currently being redeveloped, and you're going to look much nicer and shinier by the time you get to the next series. That's at eofftv.com. You can find me on Twitter, Facebook. I am sort of on Instagram, but I haven't used it for years because I'm old and I don't really understand it. But Twitter and Facebook, I'm on there. Come and say hello. Come and join the EOFF Facebook group, and come and introduce yourself and tell us what your favourite Hammer film is. Come and tell me. That'd be really good.
What if it's Scars of Dracula though, Kev?
You get blocked straight away. You're blocked, and I'll call the police. Frankly, but if you're on Facebook and you're a Hammer fan or you want to get into Hammer, I can highly recommend a friend of mine, Matt Gemmell, who runs the Hammer Lovers group. Get in there, really lovely bunch of guys. A lot of really sort of top writers and big name fans in there. They know their stuff. These guys are brilliant, and you'll see some fantastic infighting over Scars of Dracula. It's marvellous. So do go along and have a look. Tell them I sent you. So.
Excellent, amazing, Kevin. Thank you so much for joining me.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to this week's brilliant guest, the wonderful Kevin Lyons. So I'd love to hear what you guys thought of these two Dracula films. How do they rank for you in the pantheon of Dracula movies that we're exploring across this series? Please do get in touch. You can email us, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on all the socials, Facebook, Twitter, Letterboxd, and Instagram. If you want to discuss this week's episode and anything else horror related with fellow listeners, then there are two places you can go to. You can join the Evolution of Horror discussion group on Facebook, or you can also join our Discord, the Evolution of Horror Discord. If you want to sign up to weekly bonus episodes, we've got so much great stuff going on at the moment on our Patreon channel. This week we had a new episode of Fresh Blood. That's our monthly strand where we review new releases. Brad, Becky, Louise and I discussed movies like Alex Garland's Men and Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, so you can check that out if you're a $5 donor. If you're a $10 donor, you get access to our exclusive mini-seasons, which at the moment we're in the middle of a Jurassic Park retrospective, and then we're going to be reviewing the new Jurassic World movie in the next couple of weeks. So sign up to our Patreon for all of that and more. Patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. You can find this podcast in all the usual podcast places, and if you get a moment, we would be so grateful if you could drop us a little rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, whichever one you use, as that really helps us get discovered by new listeners. Okay, onwards to next week then, and we're staying in the world of Hammer, but we're jumping forward a decade to see just how different the Dracula movies became in the 1970s. Now, we teased it a little bit there in my conversation with Kevin, but next week I'm going to be joined by Graham Saunders to discuss Dracula AD 1972 from obviously 1972, and The Satanic Rites of Dracula from 1973. These are both very fun films. Join us next week for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.